Okay, well, hello again, and welcome back to the next of our topics. We're moving on into a period that's actually a pretty important one and a fairly interesting one, but one that isn't as maybe well known or well covered or well recognized as being sort of significant periods in American history, right, in the way that, the 1920s or the Depression or World War II or the Cold War, things like that are. But in reality, the period of about 30 years from around the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century sees a lot of changes in American life in a lot of different areas: politics, settlement patterns, culture, society, the economy, and a lot of what we would recognize about America that we live in today in our daily lives derives in one way or another from things that at least get started during this period. It's known as the Gilded Age. We won't go into why that is. It has to do with a term that Mark Twain used for the time period and that kind of thing. But in essence, what we're going to do is kind of take a broad overview of this 30-year time period. Unfortunately, what that means is, unlike some of the other sections that we have recordings for, this one doesn't break down as easily into nice, small, manageable chunks. And so I had to break it down into two different halves, but the two halves are probably going to be somewhat longer in terms of the recordings than they are in some of the other sections that we will be doing. And so I apologize for that. Kind of tackle it however works best for you. The second part, I think, is probably going to be longer in this case than the first part. But, just bear with me, and I appreciate your patience and willingness to sit through this. I hope everybody's doing really, really well. Let me know if you've got questions about any of this material. And without further ado, let's get going. So during this 30-year time period, there is one significant thing that's taking place that in some ways is, I guess you could say, sort of the starting point for a lot of the other changes that we will see. And that is a fairly dramatic change in the population of the United States, not just in terms of the overall numbers, but also in terms of where those people are living in the country and where those people are coming from. So you have a fairly significant growth rate of the population of the country itself, and that's added to a period of really dramatic immigration. And we'll talk about immigration in more detail a little bit later, but that's just to kind of put the bug in your ear as of right now to let you know that that's a factor in what's taking place. So during this time, there are a lot of people that are moving westward. This is spurred by a handful of different things. For one, there is, during the Civil War, the creation of what's called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was a law that's passed by Congress in order to try to encourage the expansion of population in free states and territories, right? This is a time during the Civil War when the issue of slavery is right front and center of everything that's going on in the country. And so Lincoln and Congress are trying to encourage white settlers who do not own slaves, and to some extent freed blacks, to move into areas to guarantee that, regardless the outcome of the Civil War, that there would be a larger population and a more widely distributed population of non-slaveholding people. So this is a really advantageous kind of a law. Basically, if you pay a fairly small fee, sort of an application fee, and if you live on a particular plot of land that the government designates to you, if you live there for 5 years, you get title to that land free and clear. So it's an easy way to get a potentially significant amount of land without a lot of expense and without, in some ways, without a lot of effort. Some parts of the country that are part of the Homestead Act are easier to settle than others. And so that's going to be a significant problem depending on where you end up. But it is going to encourage the movement of people out west. One of the other things that's going to encourage that movement is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad begins as a single east to west and west to east line that stretches across the country and allows for the movement of people all the way from basically California to the East Coast, or vice versa. And so this is going to make it way easier for people to make it those long distances into the interior and western parts of the country without needing to have a wagon, have a team of horses, that kind of thing, which can be expensive, it can be dangerous, it can be difficult. And so the development and completion of the railroad, as well as the expansion of the railroad service, is really going to play a big role in the movement of people out west as well. Over time, the economy and the sort of culture and society of the western states end up being centered largely on one of three different areas, and that's mining, ranching, and farming. And so each of these different kinds of occupations or industries has its own challenges, and it has its own impact on the environment, it has its own impact on the society, but it also in some cases reflects really interesting points of connection from one to the other, especially when we talk about ranchers and farmers, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So the map that you've got there is population distribution, population density of the United States, and it goes all the way from 1790 to 1870, so it's leading up to the time period that we're beginning at. But you can see that the red sections, right, the more densely populated parts of the country, are from east of the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River, and you're starting by 1870 to see patches of red appear in places around eastern Texas, places in the Bay Area of California, and so on, right? So it is definitely a transition that is going to have a significant impact on the overall development of the United States. And as I said, one of the things that contributes to this is the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the first main trunk line, right, the first main line that runs east to west, goes through what's near Salt Lake City. And so you can see the SLC dot in the kind of left center of the map. The line there, the kind of unbroken line that runs through Denver and then up and west from there, that's the original Transcontinental Railroad. But over time, other trunk lines, right, the trunk is the east-west main corridor, right? Other trunk lines are built that go through the southern states and that go through the northern states and territories. And then maybe even more important are those spur lines, and those are the ones that are built that run north to south, because those are going to open up areas in places like Wyoming or New Mexico or Idaho or other places to help facilitate the movement of people into areas that aren't directly off of that, that east-west trunk. And so from 1869, for the next 50 to 60 years, the railroads expand really rapidly and cover a fairly large portion of the sort of plains states, Rocky Mountain states, western states, and so on. And so that's also going to be a factor in the movement of people, but also the movement of goods. And when we get to ranching in particular, the location of these railroad lines are going to be a significant feature in the way that ranchers have to sort of ply their trade as well. So we mentioned three different occupations, three different industries that really define the western states. And in no particular order, we're going to start with mining. Mining is probably the most profitable of these, in the sense that if a person or a company manages to find a successful mine, that they can make fantastic amounts of money very, very quickly. More often than not, though, these claims are fairly short-lived. And we tend to think, when we think of mining, as, gold rushes, right? Well, oh, the California gold rush, or the Black Hills gold rush in South Dakota, or the Alaska gold rush in the Yukon. Yeah, gold rushes were certainly a part of this, but way more money was made by people who were mining other kinds of minerals, things like copper, or tin, or lead, or aluminum, things that are going to help power the industrial expansion of the country, that aren't necessarily the sexy kind of money metals like gold and silver, but these are things that are as important or more important, and in some cases, claims that have large lead deposits or tin deposits, they're probably going to last longer than a claim that has a gold deposit, just because there's more tin and lead in the world than there is gold. And so some claims have very short lifespans. In other cases, especially if it's one of those heavy metals that is used for industry, it can have a long lifespan. And so the money is made from volume more than it is from the value of the individual ounce or pound of the metal itself. So in a lot of cases, especially those cases of gold or silver booms, you have boom towns, right, which grow up very quickly. The picture there on the right is Deadwood, South Dakota. Deadwood grows because of a gold discovery in the Black Hills in sort of southwestern South Dakota, and grows up literally over a span of a couple weeks and dies out pretty much as soon as the gold deposit runs dry. And then they end up leaving, ghost towns, right? That's the life cycle of a boom town. And so boom towns typically don't last very long. The ones that still exist today have turned into tourist attractions more than anything else, whether it's Tombstone, Arizona, or Deadwood, or places like that. But in some cases, what used to be a boom town that was established as much as a result of a gold strike or a mineral strike, if they can manage to draw the railroad to that area, they can have more permanent success, because then they become about something more than just providing services for the mining population and all the support population that's going to settle there because of that. So some towns, places like Denver or San Francisco, become really, really important political centers, financial centers, largely because they managed to sort of court the railroads and get the railroads to go through their cities, which means that the railroads bring other kinds of responsibilities and opportunities to these towns besides just housing the hotels and casinos and brothels and saloons and things that the mining population would want. In the cases where they can't get those railroads, these towns end up being really fascinating kinds of examples. Even today, sociologists and anthropologists and historians and geographers will look at the life cycle of boom towns because they're providing a glimpse at the evolutionary sort of process of a human settlement condensed into a very small length of time, very short length of time. And so mining, if you're lucky enough, you can get incredibly wealthy as a result of it. But most people don't make a success out of mining, and even the ones that do, oftentimes the length that particular claim is going to pay out really doesn't last very long in a lot of ways. And so the other two kinds of occupations or industries, economies that define the western states, the central and western states, would be ranching and farming. And these two are definitely intertwined in a lot of ways. Ranching is centered primarily in Texas and Oklahoma. That's not to say, certainly, that there aren't ranches in other parts of the central or mountain states, but those are the two states that really sort of define that particular industry. And in some cases, you're talking about ranches that are in the hundreds of thousands of acres, right? Absolutely enormous amounts of land that would be the equivalent almost of a small state in the eastern seaboard. And so you have people that can make really, really substantial amounts of money, who can have a great deal of influence politically, socially, economically as a result of the power that they have, not just in terms of the land that they control, but the wealth that they can build off of ranching as an industry. But ranches are only where the cattle are being raised, right? And keep in mind, these are not dairy cattle, these are beef cattle, right? And beef cattle are only valuable once they are processed, let's say, to be sort of gentle about it. And the cattle are not being processed on the ranch. They're being processed in cities like Kansas City or St. Louis or Chicago or Denver, Cincinnati, right? Cities that are not in the center of the ranch geography. And what that means is that ranchers will have to manage to drive hundreds or thousands of head of cattle out of the ranch area in Texas or Oklahoma and drive those cattle north to where they can meet the railroads. And so you've got a map here, and you can see lots of different north and south lines of cattle trails. And then you see in Kansas and Missouri, you see these dramatic kinds of east to west cutoffs. Well, that east to west cutoff is there because that's where the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, runs. It goes from St. Louis through Missouri, through central Kansas, and then ultimately up through Colorado and out towards Utah and the West Coast. And so these cattle are being driven, in some cases, hundreds or maybe even close to 1,000 miles along these cattle trails so that they can be delivered to the rail centers, whether it's in Kansas, whether it's in Missouri or Colorado or wherever the case may be. There they're going to be the cows are going to be put on railroad cars and then shipped to one of these major meatpacking cities in the Midwest or in the Rocky Mountains, where they're going to be processed, and then the meat will be distributed through other parts of the country. Part of the problem with this cattle drive system, though, is you're talking about hundreds or thousands of head of cattle, and you're talking about them being marched through areas that are not well organized or well defined. In some cases, this is land that is owned by farmers, and the cattle are destroying the crops as they're walking through it, or destroying the crops as they're eating the crops on the way. This is going to contribute to some pretty serious tension and in some cases outright violence between the farm population and the ranchers. In other cases, you have disputes over water sources, right? Ranchers need to provide stable and sort of perpetual water sources to give water to their cattle. Farmers need the same water in some cases in order to water their crops. And there's only so much water to go around, especially in the central part of the country. It's not a terribly damp or fertile area, naturally. And so you have, in some cases, minor levels of disputes and disagreements and tension. But in the worst case scenario, you have what are known as range wars, right? Outright combat, basically, between farmers and their sometimes hired guns, and ranchers and their sometimes hired guns. And this ends up being pretty serious in some respects. And the population to maintain law and order isn't really all that significant in some of these areas. It's fairly widespread and doesn't necessarily have the resources to keep all of this in line. So ranching is another one of these significant parts of the Western economy. Farming, though, by far is the most common, right? Way more people are farmers than they are miners or they are ranchers. partially because it's easy to get out of the eastern and midwestern areas if you're in a city on the East Coast, or if you're even in parts of Pennsylvania or Virginia or Indiana or something like that. For one reason or another, you might decide that you want to, try your hand at setting up a farm in Nebraska or eastern Colorado or wherever. You can get there fairly easily and fairly cheaply by taking the railroad. The problem is many people that do this aren't prepared for what they're going to face. Maybe they have never farmed in their life, so they don't actually have any experience or knowledge of it. Maybe the issue is that the places that they have been farmers, whether it's Pennsylvania or Ohio or Michigan, very different climate, very different soil than what they're going to face when they arrive in Nebraska or in Kansas or in South Dakota, right? Because very little water, very dry soil, you can't grow the same kinds of things, you can't grow them in the same way. And so a lot of people that try their hand at this kind of farming experiment end up not successful, and in many cases they end up having to sell all of their possessions at a loss in order to try to raise money to go back either to the city where they came from or to the nearest possible place where they think they can find a job, find something to make a living. Excuse me. Well, this is going to cause a problem for those cities, because at the same time that people are moving out and moving back in, those cities are also experiencing a pretty dramatic influx of people coming from outside of the country. And so when you're combining a growth in sort of new population, as people are coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe, along with a simultaneous growth because of people who have left the city to try to make a living as a farmer, are ultimately unsuccessful at that, and then are forced to come back to the city. You have a lot of strain and pressure put on those cities' ability to provide housing, provide public services, whether it's sanitation, water, heat, public health, right, those kinds of things. And so that's something that we will talk about when we get into the second half of the recording for the Gilded Age material, but it's something to keep in mind because it's definitely going to play a role in how all of this process works out. So when Americans and immigrants, whites, let's say, are moving into these central and western states, they're not moving into empty space, right? This is space that had been claimed, in some cases, for thousands of years by people. But more often than not, the whites that move into these areas have no qualms whatsoever about taking the land from the Native Americans who have lived there for generations and generations, partially because the whites say, well, sure, the Indians have lived here for a while, that's all well and good, but it's not like they've done anything to the land, right? They haven't planted crops, they haven't built houses, they haven't started businesses, they haven't been digging for gold. So they haven't done anything to establish a legitimate claim to that land. If you're not going to exploit it to its fullest potential, then you don't deserve to claim that the land is yours. You should move along and open up that space to people who will take advantage of everything that it has to offer. And so as more and more whites start moving into these states and territories, the possibility for coexistence decreases pretty dramatically, right? Because they already are starting out from a point of incompatibility and sort of disrespect. And on top of that, then you have more and more and more and more whites moving into the area. It means that there's virtually no chance by the 1840s, 1850s, let alone by the 1880s, for the two groups to coexist and find some sort of no pun intended, some sort of common ground. And so, starting in the 1820s and 1830s, the government begins a process that's known as concentration. Over time, it will lead to the reservation system, right? A system that is still in operation today, where Native Americans, in some cases from completely different parts of the country, whether it's from Maine or Florida, or Washington State or Texas, will end up being shoved onto fairly small spaces, in many cases in places that are not really practical for human settlement. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, that is the government agency that's responsible for overseeing Indian policy, was often just rampantly corrupt, filled with people who sort of got squeezed out the bottom of the bureaucratic system to the point where the BIA was the only option available to them, ended up being extremely racist. And so this is a very tragic irony in that the people who were responsible for protecting and ensuring the rights and sort of services that Native Americans would have been granted as part of the treaties and negotiations that put them on the reservations, the part of the government that's responsible for ensuring as positive a way of life as possible, is actually the part of the government that is working against the Native Americans themselves, right? And so there's no real recourse for them to push for any kind of improvement or change or redress. For some, especially the Sioux, Plains Indians especially, one of the other factors that leads to very serious problems for them is the wanton devastation of the buffalo population. And obviously it's not as though people were going out counting individual buffalo, but estimates, fairly, solid estimates of the buffalo population at the end of the Civil War, so before the real surge of white settlement into the West began, the population was probably around 15 million animals. Within 10 years, the population of buffalo goes down to an estimated 4,000. So this is basically a buffalo genocide, right? The deliberate extermination of an entire species. And part of this was done intentionally to undermine the ability for the Plains Indians to survive, right? Because their whole lifestyle was based on the buffalo. Food, clothing from buffalo hides and leather, teepees, right, made out of buffalo skins, tools, implements for food and for sewing and that kind of thing made out of bones. Culturally, the buffalo figures very large in Plains Indians' religious beliefs. So a very, very significant animal in a lot of ways. So part of the destruction of the buffalo population was intentional, but part of it was really just a lot of people that decided, hey, wouldn't it be fun to just take a train out into the middle of the plains and sit there and wait and just shoot at some buffalo? And that's basically what happened. So they would buy tickets, take their rifles with them, get on the train, ride out into the center of a buffalo herd, point their rifles out the windows or climb up to the roof of the train, and just shoot as many animals as possible, and then drive away, right? Take the train back home. And so this ends up being a very serious problem for the Plains Indians in particular. Certainly we can't say, well, this affects the Navajo or the Apache or things like that. It doesn't, because those are not tribes that rely on the buffalo in the same way. But thousands and thousands and thousands of Native Americans that are part of the Plains region, this is a serious problem. So one of the other things that is contributing to the decrease of Native American identity and Native American culture comes in what's called the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act is passed in 1887. And the idea here was to essentially to turn Native Americans white, right? To encourage or force Native Americans to assimilate into white culture. And the theory, and this wasn't entirely uncommon, the theory was, well, we're doing people a favor, a service by encouraging this, because it will protect them from white misbehavior or white prejudice if we can make them wear white clothing, if we can make them speak English, if we can make them into Christians, if we can try to forcefully integrate them into dominant mainstream white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, this will mean that there won't be as many glaring reasons for white people to express their bigotry and prejudice against Native Americans. And so this included oftentimes the requirement that Native Americans settle on farmland, although they were given land that wasn't really good for farming. Children in Native American families were forced to go to Indian boarding schools in the Midwest and eastern states, where they would be brought up in a culture and in a tradition that was completely different from their parents. And so these are some pictures of the process of assimilation. The one at the bottom is from, I think, Carlisle Indian School, which was probably the most famous Indian school. It was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, of a young man who, when he arrived, was dressed in traditional Plains Indians garb, and when he left, actually even in the few weeks after he arrived, he would have been put through a process of, getting haircut, changing clothes, basically breaking those ties, breaking those cultural kinds of connections that had originally linked him to his traditional past. And so this kind of tension over the arrival of people or the movement of people, the stresses over how white America deals with non-white America is going to come back again when we talk about the experience of immigrants during the Gilded Age. And we'll return to the immigration issue a couple times through the course. But it is a definite kind of thread that we can trace all the way through a lot of American history. And, as you're hopefully aware, it's still a point of conversation today, even. So that's the end of this section. Again, I apologize. These two, there wasn't really a good way to break it down any more than into one half and two half. So they're going to be a little bit longer. The next one I'll try to get through as quickly as I can as well, but it's probably going to be a little bit longer than usual as well. So I appreciate your patience. Let me know if you've got questions about anything, and I will see you soon.